Tonight we come to a narrow strip of ground between the mountains and the sea, on the eve of one of the most famous last stands in all of history, a place where, in a few days' time, a few thousand men will choose to stand against an empire, and a few hundred of them will choose to die rather than yield. The place is called Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the warm springs that steam up out of the ground here. It is a narrow mountain pass on the coast of Greece, so tight in places that only a handful of men can walk abreast, hemmed in by steep cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. It is the gateway into the heart of Greece, the one road a great army must pass through to march south into the Greek lands. And that is why, tonight, it is about to become the most important patch of ground in the world. Camped in the pass is a small force of Greek soldiers, a few thousand strong, and spread across the plain beyond, filling the land as far as the eye can see, their countless campfires glittering in the dark like a second sky fallen to earth, is the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled, hundreds of thousands of men, drawn from every corner of the vast Persian Empire, come to crush Greece and add it to the greatest empire the world had yet known. At the head of the tiny Greek force stands a king. His name is Leonidas, king of Sparta, and he has come here with 300 of his own men, knowing, because an oracle has all but told him so, that he is not going to leave this pass alive. Tonight I'll tell you the whole story of what happens here, why so few came to face so many, how they held, how they were betrayed, and why 300 men who lost a battle became, for the next 2,500 years, the world's most enduring symbol of courage against impossible odds. To understand the men in the pass, you have to understand the wave that was breaking over them. The Persian Empire in this age was the superpower of the world, an empire so vast it stretched from the edge of India across the whole of the Middle East to the shores of the Mediterranean, ruling countless peoples and commanding wealth and manpower beyond anything the small, quarrelsome cities of Greece could imagine. And its great king, a ruler named Xerxes, had decided to swallow Greece whole. His father before him had tried and failed, beaten back years earlier by the Athenians on the plain of Marathon, and Xerxes had inherited both the empire and the grudge. He assembled a force meant to make failure impossible, an army so enormous that the ancient writers, reaching for the scale of it, claimed it numbered in the millions. That was surely an exaggeration, a number meant to convey terror rather than an actual count. But even stripped down to what modern reckoning allows, it was a host of staggering size, hundreds of thousands strong, the largest army anyone had ever seen, gathered from dozens of subject nations, and behind it a great fleet shadowing the coast. The scale of Xerxes' ambition showed in everything he did on the march. To bring his army across the strait that divides Asia from Europe, he had his engineers lash together a bridge of boats stretching across the open water. And when a storm smashed his first bridge apart, the king, in a rage, is said to have ordered the very sea to be whipped and cursed for its defiance, and then had a second bridge built and marched his millions across, to slip his fleet safely past a dangerous headland. He had a canal dug straight through a peninsula. This was a man who bent seas and mountains to his will, who commanded the resources of half the known world, and who was coming to Greece not merely to defeat it, but to erase it, to burn its cities, enslave its people, and fold its scattered little states into his empire like every other land his family had conquered. And Greece was in no shape to stop him. Greece, in this age, was not a country. It was a scatter of independent city-states, dozens of them, each fiercely proud, each jealous of the others, forever squabbling and warring among themselves, with no king and no central power to unite them. Athens and Sparta, the two greatest, were rivals as much as allies. Faced with the Persian tidal wave, many of the Greek states simply gave up before it arrived, sending earth and water to Xerxes, the tokens of submission. choosing survival under Persian rule over annihilation. Whole regions bowed. The odds were so lopsided that submission looked like the only sane choice. But not all of them bent. A coalition of Greek states, led by Athens on the sea and Sparta on the land, resolved to resist, to fight the invasion rather than kneel to it. They were badly outnumbered, disunited, and facing the most powerful empire on earth. But they had certain advantages the raw numbers didn't show. They were fighting for their homes and their freedom, on their own ground, which they knew intimately. They were, man for man, among the finest heavy infantry in the world, and they had, in the pass of Thermopylae, a place where the Persian numbers might be turned from an overwhelming strength into something close to useless. The plan was to plug the narrow gate with a small force of the best soldiers Greece could offer, and hold the wave back long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. And for that job, for holding the gate against the world, the natural choice was the most feared soldiers in all of Greece, the Spartans. There has never been, before or since, a society quite like Sparta, and to understand the 300 you have to understand the strange and terrible machine that produced them. Sparta was not a city that happened to have good soldiers. Sparta was a society engineered from top to bottom to produce nothing but soldiers. A whole state organized around war the way other states are organized around trade or worship. A Spartan boy did not belong to his family. He belonged to the state. His whole life was war. Taken from his mother while still a child, he was thrown into a brutal communal upbringing designed to forge him into a perfect warrior. Starved so that he would learn to steal and endure hunger, beaten to teach him to bear pain without a sound, drilled and hardened and tested year after year in a regime so severe that boys sometimes died in the training. They were taught to endure anything, to fear nothing, to value discipline and obedience above their own lives, and to regard death in battle as the finest thing a man could achieve, and retreat, surrender, or cowardice as a disgrace worse than any death. A Spartan mother, the stories say, handed her son his shield as he marched to war with a single grim instruction: to come back carrying it, victorious, or to come back dead upon it, carried by his comrades, but never to come back having thrown it away in flight. To be a Spartan was to have been raised from birth for exactly one purpose: to stand in the battle line and hold it, whatever came, and to die there without flinching if that was what holding it required. These were the men Greece sent to the hot gates, and their king was about to lead them there under a shadow that made the mission darker still, because before Leonidas ever marched, the gods themselves seemed to have promised that he would not return. Leonidas was one of the two kings of Sparta, for by their ancient custom, the Spartans always had two kings ruling side by side, and he was a man in the fullness of middle age, hardened by a lifetime of the Spartan way when the crisis came. And before he marched, he did what Greeks did before any great undertaking. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred prophetic voice in the Greek world, to learn what the gods foretold. The answer that came back was grim, and it shaped everything that followed. The oracle declared that either Sparta itself would be destroyed by the invaders, or else a Spartan king would die. That one of these two things must happen, that the city could be saved only by the death of a king of the line of Sparta's ancient hero. Leonidas seems to have taken that prophecy and made it his own. If the price of Sparta's survival was the death of a Spartan king, then he would pay it himself. He marched north not as a man hoping to win a battle and come home, but as a man who had already, in some deep place, accepted that he was going to his death, and had decided to make that death count for as much as one man's death possibly could. But here we come to one of the strangest facts of the whole story, the question that has puzzled people for 2,500 years. Why did the most warlike state in Greece send only 300 men to hold the gate against the largest army in the world? Part of the answer was timing and religion. The Persian invasion arrived during a sacred period in the Greek calendar, a great religious festival that the deeply pious Spartans would not violate, and the Olympic truce besides, a time when Spartan law forbade the army from marching out to war. To send the full Spartan army immediately would have broken a religious law the Spartans held sacred. And so, rather than do nothing, Leonidas took only what he could lawfully take: his personal royal bodyguard, 300 hand-picked Spartan warriors, and marched north at once to hold the pass until the full army could follow after the festival ended. And there is a chilling detail in how those 300 were chosen. Leonidas selected only men who had living sons, men who already had heirs to carry on their families. He was, quite deliberately, choosing men whose bloodlines would survive their deaths. He was picking men to die, and making sure that when they died, no family name would be extinguished with them. It is one of the coldest, clearest signals in the whole story of what this mission truly was. These 300 were not an advance guard expected to hold and be relieved. On some level, everyone understood they were a sacrifice, the finest men Sparta had, sent to buy time with their lives. Leonidas and his 300 did not march alone, and it is worth remembering that, because the popular memory sometimes forgets it. As they moved north, other Greeks joined them, contingents from allied cities along the way, men from Thespiae and Thebes and Arcadia and Corinth and elsewhere, until the force holding the pass numbered not 300, but something closer to 7,000. The 300 Spartans were the hardcore, the most feared and disciplined among them, and their king commanded the whole. But thousands of other Greeks stood in that pass too, and many of them would fight and die as bravely as any Spartan. The 300 became the legend. They were never the whole story. They came to Thermopylae and looked at the ground, and understood at once why it had been chosen. The pass was a bottleneck, a narrow corridor squeezed between the steep mountains and the sea, in places only wide enough for a single wagon, a place where a vast army could not spread out and bring its numbers to bear. Here the hundreds of thousands of Persians would be forced to funnel into a narrow front, where only a few hundred could come to grips at any one time. And on that narrow front, the heavy-armored Greek infantry, fighting shoulder to shoulder in their tight, disciplined line, would meet them on something close to equal terms. The Persian advantage of numbers, so overwhelming in the open field, would be squeezed down to almost nothing in the throat of the pass. It was the one place in Greece where a few could hope to hold against many. There was an old, ruined wall across the narrowest part of the pass, built by earlier generations, and the Greeks set to work rebuilding it, raising it up as a barrier to fight behind and fall back to. And then they waited, this small force in the great gate, and watched the Persian host come on, a tide of men and horses and wagons that took days to arrive and filled the plain beyond the pass from mountain to sea, until the little Greek force stood like a handful of stones set against the sea itself. Somewhere in that endless camp was the great King Xerxes, master of the world, come to open the gate to Greece, and in the pass before him stood Leonidas, and his 300 men chosen to die, and their few thousand allies, waiting behind an old stone wall for the greatest army on earth to try them. Before the fighting began, there was a strange pause, days of waiting, while Xerxes, arriving with his host, simply could not believe what he was seeing. A few thousand men had planted themselves in his path and showed no sign of running. It made no sense to him. He sent a scout on horseback to ride up close to the pass and see what these madmen were doing. The scout came back with a report that baffled the great king entirely. The Spartans, he said, were not manning the wall in fear, not sharpening weapons in grim preparation, not doing any of the things a doomed and terrified garrison ought to do. They were instead calmly exercising, stripped for sport in the sun, and combing and dressing their long hair. Xerxes could not understand it and asked one of his advisors, an exiled Spartan king who knew these men, what it meant. The answer he got was chilling, that this was the Spartan custom, that when these men prepared to risk their lives, they groomed their hair with care, because they were a people who dressed their heads when they were about to fight and very possibly to die. The advisor warned Xerxes plainly that these were the bravest men in Greece, and that they meant to contest the pass, and that the king had never faced anything like them. Xerxes laughed it off. He could not conceive that so few would truly stand against so many. Still, Xerxes was willing to let them save themselves. He sent envoys to the Greeks with an offer, and then a demand. First the offer: submit, lay down your arms, become subjects of the great king, and you will not only be spared but rewarded, given good land, treated as friends. The Greeks refused. Then came the demand, blunt and simple, an order to hand over their weapons. And Leonidas sent back a reply of just 2 words that has echoed down the centuries ever since. A reply so perfectly, defiantly Spartan that it became immortal. Told to surrender his arms, the king answered, "Come and take them." That was the whole of it. Come and take them. No pleading, no defiance dressed up in speeches. Just a flat, fearless invitation to the most powerful man in the world to come and try. And there is another line from those days that captures the same spirit, spoken by one of the Spartan soldiers, when a man warned him that the Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows, loosed all together, would darken the sun and blot out the sky. The Spartan answered, without a flicker of concern, that this was good news, for then they would fight their battle in the shade. That was the temper of the men in the pass. They knew the odds. They had counted the enemy, and they met the prospect of being buried under a sky full of arrows with a grim joke and a comb through their hair. Xerxes waited several days, expecting the tiny force to lose its nerve and melt away. It did not, and at last, his patience gone and his pride stung, the great king gave the order to attack, to go and take, by force, the men who would not surrender. He sent his infantry forward into the pass in waves, and the pass devoured them. The narrow ground did exactly what the Greeks had counted on. The Persians, for all their numbers, could only come at the Greek line a few hundred at a time, funneled into the bottleneck, and there they ran headlong into a wall of heavy-armored Greeks fighting in the tight, interlocking formation they had drilled for all their lives. A solid hedge of long spears and overlapping shields, disciplined, immovable, grinding forward and falling back in unison. The Persian soldiers, more lightly armored, their shorter weapons unable to reach past the long Greek spears, were slaughtered against that line in appalling numbers, packed too tightly in the narrow pass even to flee, driven forward by the press of their own comrades and the officers behind them onto the Greek spear points. Wave after wave was hurled into the gate, and wave after wave broke and died there, until the ground was carpeted with the Persian dead, and the attacks achieved nothing at all. In his fury and disbelief, Xerxes played his strongest card. He had a corps of elite household troops, the finest soldiers in the entire empire, a body of 10,000 picked warriors so prestigious and so feared that they were called the Immortals, because their number was always kept full, every fallen man instantly replaced. Surely these, the best of the best, would sweep the stubborn Greeks aside. Xerxes sent the Immortals into the pass, and in the narrow gate, the Immortals fared no better than the rest. The same bottleneck squeezed them, the same disciplined Greek line met them, and the same slaughter followed. The very best troops of the greatest empire on earth were thrown against a few thousand Greeks in a mountain pass, and they were stopped cold and thrown back with heavy loss. It is said that Xerxes, watching from his throne set up to view his certain victory, leapt to his feet 3 times in fear and rage for his army. The first day ended with the Persians bloodied and baffled, and the Greeks still holding the wall. The second day went like the first. Xerxes, perhaps believing the Greeks must be exhausted and wounded after the previous day's fighting, sent his troops forward again, and again the pass turned them back. The Greeks fought in relays, different cities' contingents rotating through the front line, so that fresh men always held the narrowest point while the tired ones rested behind. The Persians came on and died, came on and died, and by the end of the second day, Xerxes was no closer to forcing the gate than when he had started, and had paid for the attempt with a fearful pile of his own dead. The master of the world, with hundreds of thousands of men, had been fought to a standstill by a few thousand Greeks in a crack in the mountains. He did not know what to do. And then, that night, a traitor came to his tent, and everything changed. His name was Ephialtes, a local man who knew the mountains, and he came to the Persians with the one thing Xerxes needed most: knowledge of the ground. He told the great king a secret. There was another way. A hidden path wound up over the mountains and around the pass. A rough, little-known trail through the high country that came down again behind the Greek position. An army that took it could get around Thermopylae entirely, avoid the deadly bottleneck, and fall upon the defenders from the rear, trapping them between two forces. For a promised reward, Ephialtes offered to guide the Persians along it in the dark. It was the key to the whole battle, betrayed for gold by a man who knew his own country's paths. His name would live in infamy for it. In the Greek language, his very name became a word for nightmare, for the thing that comes in the dark to undo you. And that night, Xerxes seized the gift. He sent his elite troops, the Immortals, up the hidden mountain path under cover of darkness, with Ephialtes leading them, to climb through the night, cross the high country, and come down behind the Greeks by dawn. The Greeks were not entirely blind to the danger. Leonidas had known there was a mountain path. He was too careful a soldier not to have asked, and he had posted a detachment of allied Greek troops, about 1,000 men from the region of Phocis, up on the high ground to guard exactly this route. But guarding it and holding it proved to be very different things. The Immortals climbed through the night, and in the grey light before dawn, they came upon the Phocian guards suddenly out of the trees. The Phocians, startled, scrambled to arm themselves, but they misread the situation badly. Seeing the Persians turn toward higher ground, they assumed they themselves were the target of the whole assault, and pulled back up the slope to make a stand, expecting to be attacked. But the Persians were not interested in them. The Immortals simply loosed a volley of arrows to keep the Phocians pinned and out of the way, and then swept on past them, down the path, leaving the guards standing uselessly on their hilltop, while the road to the rear of Thermopylae lay open. The one safeguard against the flanking march had failed, not through cowardice exactly, but through confusion in the crucial moment. The Immortals poured down the mountain toward the unguarded back of the pass. Down in the pass, as dawn broke, the news reached Leonidas. Lookouts and runners came down from the heights with word that the Persians had crossed the mountain in the night, that the guarding force had been brushed aside, that even now the enemy was descending behind them. The thing every defender of a pass most fears had happened. They were about to be surrounded, caught between the vast host in front and the elite troops coming down behind. The bottleneck that had been their great strength was about to become a trap with no way out. Leonidas gathered the Greek commanders in the grey morning light, and they faced the hardest decision of the whole battle. To stay was to die, that was now certain. The position was lost. Being encircled by an enemy of that size could end only one way. And so the question was not whether the battle could still be won, because it could not. The question was what to do with the lives that remained. Leonidas made his choice, and it defined him forever. He would not order a general retreat and abandon the pass without a fight, because someone had to hold the enemy long enough for the rest to escape, and because he was a Spartan king under a prophecy, sworn in his own heart to buy Sparta's safety with his death, but neither would he throw away thousands of allied lives in a hopeless stand that only he was bound to make. So he dismissed most of the army. He released the allied contingents, told them to go, to fall back while there was still time and life to fight the Persians another day, on better ground. Thousands of Greeks marched away that morning, ordered home by the king to save them for the war still to come. But Leonidas himself would stay. He and his 300 Spartans would hold the pass to the end, to cover the retreat of the others, to inflict all the harm they still could, and to die where they stood, as the prophecy and their whole way of life demanded. And they would not be entirely alone. When the order to depart was given, not everyone obeyed it. The men of Thespia, some 700 of them, refused to leave. They chose freely to stay and die beside the Spartans rather than abandon them, an act of courage that deserves to be remembered as much as the Spartans' own, for the Thespians were under no prophecy and bound by no grim Spartan code. They simply would not go. A contingent of Thebans remained as well. And so, as the sun climbed on the third and final day, a few hundred Spartans and their few remaining allies made ready behind their wall to fight their last fight, surrounded now, doomed for certain and utterly unwavering. Leonidas knew this was the end, and he no longer fought to hold the pass. That was impossible now, but to sell the lives of his men for the highest price in Persian blood that he could exact. And so, on that final morning, instead of waiting behind the wall, the Spartans and their allies advanced. They came out from the narrow neck of the pass into the wider ground, where more of them could fight at once. And they threw themselves at the enemy with the abandon of men who have already given up their lives and mean only to spend them well. There was no more careful defense, no more measured rotation of the line. There was only the fury of the doomed. They fought that morning with a violence that horrified even the vast army watching. The Spartans cut into the Persian ranks and killed, driving the enemy before them, trampling the fallen, while Persian officers behind their own men lashed them forward with whips to force them onto the Greek spears. So terrified were the Persian soldiers to close with these men. The Greeks fought until their long spears shattered from use, and then they drew their short swords and fought on with those, hacking in close. And when the swords broke or were lost, the ancient account tells us they fought on still with their hands and with their teeth, bare and savage, refusing to stop, selling every last moment as dearly as flesh could be sold. Somewhere in that final storm, Leonidas fell. The king of Sparta went down fighting in the press, killed at last amid the slaughter he had led. And over his body there erupted the most desperate fighting of the entire battle. For to the Spartans, the thought of their king's corpse falling into enemy hands was unbearable, and they fought like furies to keep it. Again and again, the Persians surged forward to seize the body, and again the Spartans hurled them back, dragging their dead king behind their line, standing over him, dying on top of him. The struggle over the fallen Leonidas raged back and forth until the Greeks, by sheer desperate ferocity, drove the enemy off and held the body of their king. But the end was closing in. The immortals who had crossed the mountain now came down behind them, and the last of the Greeks were fully surrounded, hemmed in on every side by the endless Persian host. The survivors, the last Spartans and Thespians still on their feet, drew back from the open ground to a small hillock within the pass, a final rise of earth, and there they gathered for the end, a shrinking knot of exhausted, wounded men in a sea of enemies. They stood back to back on that little hill, those who still had weapons using them, those who did not fighting with hands and teeth and whatever they could seize, and they would not surrender, and they would not run. Xerxes, in the end, did not send his men in to finish it hand to hand. He had lost far too many to these Greeks already. Instead, he simply had them destroyed at a distance. The Persian archers were brought up around the little hill, and they buried the last defenders under exactly the storm of arrows that the Spartan had joked about days before. Loosed all together, the arrows came down in a dark rain, and under that rain the last of the 300 and their companions fell, one by one, still on their feet, still defiant, until the hill fell silent and every man on it was dead. They had held the gate for 3 days. They had inflicted staggering losses on the greatest army in the world, and to the last man on that final hill, not one of them had run. In the cold accounting of war, Thermopylae was a defeat. The pass was lost. The Persians poured through into Greece, marched south, and burned the city of Athens itself, whose people had abandoned it ahead of the flames. Xerxes, in a rage that betrayed how much these men had cost and shamed him, ordered the body of the dead Leonidas treated with a savagery Persians normally reserved for the worst criminals. A final, futile insult to a king he could not defeat in life. By every immediate measure, the stand at the hot gates had failed to stop him. And yet it changed everything. The 3 days the Greeks bought at Thermopylae were not wasted. They gave the rest of Greece precious time to prepare, to gather their fleets and armies, to steel their nerve. And more than time, the stand gave them something no amount of preparation could, an example of defiance so total, so magnificent, that it shamed the wavering and fired the resolute. If 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies could do that to Xerxes' host, then the invaders were not invincible after all. Within weeks, the Greek fleet shattered the Persian navy in the narrow waters of Salamis, and the following year, a united Greek army crushed the Persian land force and drove the invasion out of Greece for good. The tide that had seemed unstoppable was turned back, and Greece remained free, free to become the civilization that would shape the entire future of the Western world. And the men in the pass, though they did not live to see it, had lit the way to that victory. They buried the dead where they fell, in the pass, and later the Greeks raised a monument on the little hill where the last of them died, and on it they carved a few plain words for the Spartan dead. Words with no boasting in them, no grand claims, just a quiet message from the dead to any traveler who might one day pass through the hot gates and wonder who lay there. The lines have never been bettered as an epitaph for men who did their duty and died. They said simply that if you are passing by, you should go and tell the Spartans, back home in their city, that here in this pass their men lie dead, because here they stayed, obedient to the laws of their homeland, and did not leave. That was all. Go tell them we stayed. Go tell them we obeyed our laws. There is no grander boast in all of history than that plain sentence, precisely because it makes no boast at all. The men who held Thermopylae did not think they had done anything but their duty. They had been told to hold the pass, and they held it to the last man and the last breath, and they asked to be remembered only for that. And remembered they have been, for 2,500 years, longer than almost any victory. Their doomed and magnificent stand has stood as the world's purest symbol of courage in the face of certain death, of the free few who choose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. Let it all grow quiet now, and settle, and drift away into the dark. The narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, the countless campfires of the great host, and the small band behind the old stone wall, the king who marched out knowing he would not return, and the men who combed their hair before they died, and the 2 words flung back at an empire, come and take them, the last hill, and the dark rain of arrows, and the plain words carved on the stone. Let all of it grow soft and far away now, 2,500 years deep, and let the men who held the gate rest at last where they fell. You don't have to carry any of it. The battle was won and lost long ago. The pass is quiet now. The stone still stands. There is nothing left in that far-off morning that can trouble you here, in the warmth and the dark, with nothing at all being asked of you tonight. So let the past blur and fade, and let yourself sink down out of the noise and the clash of it into the deep, still calm beneath, where there are no battles left to fight, and no gates left to hold, and nothing in the world that needs you now. Rest. The men of the past kept their watch long ago, so that you would never have to. Let them keep it, and sleep. And when the dark comes down again, I'll be here to carry you off to another time long ago, while the wonder of it still stands. Sleep well.